So to begin, hello, and thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on your location. I know a lot of you are far away. My name is Cassandra, and I'm a concurrent MBA and PP student between Harvard Kennedy School and Stanford University, and I'm the co-chair of the Latinx caucus at HKS. I want to start with a few announcements on the center's behalf. First, the Ash Center would like to acknowledge the land on which Harvard sits as the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people, and a place that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We would also like to acknowledge the co-sponsors for this event. Along with the Ash Center, today's talk is co-sponsored by the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, the Asian American Pacific Islander Caucus, and the Latinx Caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School. This event is being recorded, and the video will be made publicly available on the Ash Center YouTube channel. You're welcome to submit questions anytime throughout the duration of the event, but please send them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen instead of submitting them through the chat. Now I'd like to briefly introduce today's speakers and moderators. To begin, Sonia Diaz is the founding executive director of the UCLA Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, a comprehensive think tank that addresses the most critical domestic policy challenges facing communities of color in states and localities across the U.S. Diaz served as the policy counsel to Vice President Kamala D. Harris during her first and second terms as California Attorney General and directed voter protection programs for Democratic candidates in Virginia during the 2016 election. Diaz also managed domestic policy portfolios at three California nonprofits, clerked in the White House's Domestic Policy Council under President Barack Obama, and supported litigation efforts at MALDEF, the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and California's Bureau of Children's Justice. Minh Tu Pham is co-founder of New American Voices, which mobilizes Asian American voters and advises foundations and nonprofits on global trends and institutions. During the primary, she was an advisor on Pete Buttigieg's foreign policy team and a policy volunteer for Biden for president. She's a board member of Pivot, the progressive Vietnamese American organization. Previously, she was executive director at Global Policy at the United Nations Foundation, where for 10 years she led initiatives to make the UN more effective, tackle climate change and poverty, helping to create the Sustainable Development Goals, and improving relations between the US and the UN. Also joining us today is Jonathan Corpus-Ong, Associate Professor of Global Digital Media at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He has written 2 books and over 2 journal articles at the areas of media ethics, digital humanitarianism, and media in everyday life among marginalized communities in the Global South. Jonathan is currently a research fellow at the Shorenstein Center of Harvard Kennedy School, where he studies the anti-Asian racism and disinformation during COVID-19 and conspiracy theory in tarot and astrology online communities. Our moderator for today's conversation is Mariana Ruiz Vermat. Mariana is executive director and co-founder of Kairos, where she leads a team of strategists who use a cutting-edge and intersectional approach to building democracy and accountability into tech platforms through leadership development, advocacy, and a deep commitment to racial justice. Her approach is informed by her experiences working with Latinx women farm workers in California seeking freedom from abusive relationships and working conditions, organizing immigrants from the Caribbean working in direct family care facilities, and leading legislative policy and political campaigns that move on. Mariana is currently a Technology and Democracy Fellow at the Ash Center. Finally, my colleague and classmate, Nick Sung, and a soon-to-be graduate of the MPP program at Harvard Kennedy School, will be leading the audience conversation today, later. With that, let me hand over this to Mariana. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Cassandra. I am really honored to be able to moderate this brilliant panel. And so I want to just jump right in and not even take a minute here. You know, as we talk about disinformation, it can feel like we just began having this conversation back in 2016 during the 2016 election. But I want to offer us a different idea, which is that the idea of disinformation, or rather propaganda, is an old battle and something that we've been engaged in for centuries. Mis and disinformation has always been used to undermine movements for justice, and it has always been used to spread propaganda. But what's so scary about this moment that we're currently in, and when we look back at the 2016 election, is that right now disinformation is really being fueled by tech companies, and in particular the way that social media platforms really profit from the spread of disinformation. So they really have no incentive to stop it. And then really what it means is that they hold governing power over the internet. And as we have seen as recently as January 6th, we could say that they're also holding governance over our democracy in some ways. And nothing has really brought this moment or this point home more clearly really than the last 24 hours. Yesterday, the Facebook Oversight Board made a decision. They ruled to uphold the temporary ban against Donald Trump, but stated that Facebook does not have the power to permanently ban a user from its platform. And so then relying on the company itself to really review that policy within the next 6 months and make a determination. They really just punted the decision here. And as my colleague Jelani Drew Davy always says, Facebook needs to take a moral stance because regardless of the bottom line, unless Facebook is going to hold white supremacist rehab, then there is a need for policies and change aimed at this idea of an indefinite suspension of white supremacist people and accounts, and really the radicalization that happens through platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. And so, this is really driving us to a point of crisis for our democracy. We really need to be able to organize our communities and fight for governing power of the internet if we really want to take on this fight around disinformation. And so in today's conversation, I'm really excited to get into what are some of the core effects of mis and disinformation on AAPI and Latinx communities. We're going to look at the long-term nature of the problem and talk about strategies to organize our communities and to fight back. And, we're having this conversation right now because we're all concerned with the ways in which disinformation is disproportionately impacting communities of color. And we're concerned with the ways that radicalization has spread into AAPI and Latinx communities. But I want to be really, really super clear about something here. Effective propaganda is not random. And the most damaging examples of mis and disinformation all serve a specific purpose. They serve the purpose to further right-wing white supremacist agenda, and the purpose is aimed at radicalization. And we really saw that this right-wing organizing during the 2020 election in Florida. The Trump campaign was effectively able to leverage fears of socialism to scare Latinx voters away from voting for Biden, even though Biden is not a socialist. And as we're assessing what makes communities susceptible to mis and disinformation, we really have to understand and identify what are the underlying hegemonic ideologies that mis and disinformation is tapping into. So in other words, what is it that people are afraid of? What is it that people care about? And the ways in which mis and disinformation taps into those fears in order to exploit it and take us away from the things that are most important to us and our self-interest. So I want to turn it over to the panelists now and start to hear from them and get their perspective on this issue of mis and disinformation. So as I just mentioned, when we think about the impact in Florida, so this idea of the Biden, the socialist narrative, and the impact that this narrative had on the Florida election. I want to, we have to look at across the country itself and understand that Latinx voters are not a monolith. The narrative impacted Cuban and Venezuelan voters and those communities far more than it resonated with Puerto Rican voters. And because of the specific history of the Cuban American and Venezuelan communities have with the concept of socialism and communism. And so if we think about the fact that communities of color are not monolithic, we really need to then identify what are the effective strategies in order to organize and fight back against the mis and disinformation. And we have to understand the specific political context that each group is living within. So Sonia, I want to turn it over to you. You've emphasized in the past that the need for campaigns to approach different Latinx communities with a more tailored messaging. What are some of the underlying hegemonic ideologies that the right wing is using to target parts of the Latinx communities and in different parts of the country?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mariana, for convening this important conversation that I think really speaks to the heart of what is at stake for an inclusive democracy, the capacity for growing and youthful electorates to actually have a fair shot at casting a ballot and ensuring that they're able to elect their candidates of choice. Now, one of the things that we know is because of structural issues with our democracy, it's harder for those voters to cast a ballot. Things as simple as, not being the right age, right? So we're going to age into the electorate, and that means not getting the information that likely voters and more mature voters would get. But with that, I think one of the biggest things is that our political class has really prioritized white voters, and they have hyper segmented them and allocated, infinite resources to persuade them to change their minds. And we've seen cycle after cycle as of late under the Trump era, that money really is not getting to any changes in decision making. But instead, you're leaving a lot of voters on the table who, despite all of the odds of being ignored, of voter suppression, and of misinformation and a pandemic that has really wreaked havoc on their lives, they cast a ballot and they safeguarded our democracy. That said, the media on election night after the presidential election in November 2020 made a lot of noise about Miami-Dade and some Cuban voters there. And that became the narrative for Latino voters in the 2020 presidential election. Ultimately, research out of our think tank at UCLA, the Latino Policy and Politics Initiative, found that Latino voters in Florida at a 2-for-1 margin voted for Biden. Elsewhere, it was 3-for-1, if you look at places like Arizona or California or other places in the country. But Florida presents this important frame, which is the Republican Party has sought to compete. And they've sought to compete for Latino votes. And they've done this by expending the resources necessary to engage this community cycle after cycle, ad buys, mobilization efforts, you name it. But they've done more than that. They have allowed a non-white person to run for one of the highest offices in the land. It's Marco Rubio. And they have baked in descriptive representation. Now to the conversation that we're having right now, which is the ways in which nefarious electioneering is occurring that targets communities of color with erroneous messaging. That was certainly the case in Florida. It was certainly the case in 2016 as it related to Black male voters, and that's fact. Now in Florida, there were themes around socialism and also themes about Black Lives Matter, which was a wedge issue for some and mainly for white voters, but also thinking about what does this mean for police abuse? It focused on anti-Blackness and really white supremacy. And that resonated and it tracked. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to self-correct. But the real thing is that the Democratic Party didn't fully compete. They have not sought to galvanize non-white electeds for important offices, or if they have, they've fallen short, including in the 2018 governor's race. So to the extent that we are going to counteract misinformation, disinformation, investments need to happen so that people actually have information from trusted messengers that they can act on.
Thank you, Sonia. And I'd love to open it up. And actually, as you're talking about the way that Black Lives Matters, became a wedge issue for some Latinx voters. I want to turn it to you, Jonathan. I'm curious, as we think about, disinformation around Stop Asian Hate, what do you think are some of the motivations of MAGA followers and the AAPI community, and how does this connect to narratives around anti-Blackness?
Yeah, there's a lot of layers there about disinformation targeting and addressing Asian American communities, right? And so I think disinformation works most effectively when people are at a state of fear, of confusion, of where there's very little information. Disinformation works to sow divisiveness and create more wedge and distrust within communities, between communities of color, right? And pitting one against the other. And this general perception that mainstream media might not be representing facts and the realities as they are, like, would push some people to look for alternative news platforms. And of course, it's important to situate this moment of, disinformation targeting Asian American communities and trying to recruit them toward more right-wing beliefs and ideologies. This comes in the wake of so much targeted harassment against Asian people, and which would include forms of disinformation and conspiracy theory as well, right? Like blaming Asian people, people of Chinese descent, as originators of the virus. And you mentioned, Mariana, earlier about what the platforms should be doing. I think even, looking back at our discussions of China virus, Kung flu, these were expressions from Trump himself, but they also became trending hashtags on Twitter. And for the longest time, platforms haven't really done enough to deplatform them. Should the debate about deplatforming include whether they should be doing something about these kinds of racist expressions? I think they should be, right? And so current disinformation narratives, though, that are preying on Asian communities right now. So one is about to drive deeper that kind of crime wave frame around this rise of hate attacks and verbal harassment and violence toward Asian people, right? So there's a growing right-wing Asian online ecosystem. So smaller kinds of news pages which have a very slanted frame, and they would often kind of like communicate sometimes through using old video footage. So in a very decontextualized way. So Black on Asian crimes that might have happened 2-3 years ago become repurposed now. And to kind of, again, drive up that kind of narrative of a crime wave. And sometimes these articles in these sites would end with a clincher. So the news article might read very factual, and then there's a clincher paragraph with a very inflammatory ending, kind of saying that it has reached biblical proportions, the attack of Black people on Asian people. And of course, there's sometimes an insinuation that Asian people, go protect yourself. You're the only one who can protect yourself. Carry a gun, right? And that's really worrying. And that's a new strategy that I'm seeing.
Marianne, I want to just, hi, I just wanted to touch on something that Sonia said, which I just thought was just so important. Two things. First, just this point about our communities being ignored by campaigns. A good friend of mine who's a law professor at Berkeley, he's calling this passive voter suppression, where campaigns make a calculation as to who they should contact, and they decide that our communities are way too hard to reach because of the language barriers, because they think we just don't vote, because we think that actually our votes don't matter anyway, and that we don't sort of carry that kind of political power in terms of political donations and other things. And what he found was actually the active decision of campaigns not to go after our communities, immigrant communities, poor communities, has a greater effect in having them not vote than active voter suppression legislation. And we were talking about the hundreds of pieces of legislation that's now been passed. Just this morning, Rick DeSantis just signed in Florida. We're seeing that in Texas. We just saw that in Georgia. And those efforts are incredibly important. But just as important is this this fact that campaigns are completely ignoring our communities. And so last year, I founded New American Voices with some friends, and and we sought to try to target our own communities in swing states. So Asian Americans in language, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, Hmong even, because when you look at swing states like Wisconsin, there's a significant Hmong population. And when you look at the 2020 election, I mean, Sonia was exactly right. The campaign spent $14 billion on the 2020 cycle, $14 billion. And, a tiny fraction of that was spent on mobilizing our own communities. And we already know that the evidence says that when you mobilize our communities, it actually works, because in part it's education, in part it's sort of giving them information about how to get to the polls and that sort of thing. So, our own effort only raised, I think, about 450,000, and we reached almost every single Chinese, Vietnamese, Korean, Indian American voter in 6 swing states, plus then worked on the Georgia runoff. And, if you look at those margins, I mean, Biden won Georgia by 13,000 votes. And by some estimates, there were brand new Asian American voters in Georgia, and, about 30,000 to 80,000 brand new first-time Asian American voters in Georgia. So without that constituency, I don't think, we would have flipped that state. So that point that Sonia made is just so important. And then secondly, just to Florida and what both of you have talked about in terms of the Venezuelan and Cuban communities, the Vietnamese community are the Cubans of the AAPI community, right? So our own histories, homeland politics is very much, very similar to the Cuban American community. We fought a long war, Americans and the Vietnamese fought a long war there, and many Vietnamese fled communism and came to this country very, very staunchly anti-communist. And while that may seem anachronistic, it is alive and well in the Vietnamese American community that, this sense that the Chinese are trying to, still dominate and take over the United States, that communism is alive and well and trying to take over, American politics. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right, Mariana. Biden clearly is not a communist, but that narrative really fed into, the Vietnamese community and accounts for why a lot of them, I think more than any other, 48% of Vietnamese in one poll said that they would vote for Trump. Almost 20% didn't even respond, versus when you look at other, Asian American communities, you're upwards of 60, 70% supporting Biden versus Trump. So, that is a really important issue. And just to Jonathan's points here, these communities are being actively targeted. I received a hard copy of the Epoch Times with my full name, middle initial, address in my mailbox in Vietnamese, and this is one of these, outlets that I think Steve Bannon said was one of the most, he was, startled at how effective the Epoch Times has come in really infiltrating the Asian American community with some of this information. And the last point that I'll just raise is, when we were actively trying to find platforms to put persuasion ads in language to our communities, the websites that came back as to where most people were visiting were Breitbart and others like that. And so, when you just the other day, US News reported that a huge number of Chinese Americans and Chinese were donating to the Proud Boys. I think 80% of their funding was coming from people with Chinese last names. And so, it is a deep issue within the community, this sort of narrative of anti-communism, of Trump being much stronger against China and Biden being a communist. It's actually quite disturbing. So I just wanted to raise those points there.
Thank you, Mintu. This conversation right now is just making me think so much about how important it is to to organize our communities. And this is the point that you're making here about turning out voters in a place like Wisconsin. We really we need more investment in our communities. And then where there are gaps, the disinformation has a place to flourish. And without those gaps, it's much harder for disinformation to flourish. And I think the other point here is this is all about coordinated attacks. It's not like these are random. It's not like these are not organized. These are organized. They are smart, and they are really targeting Latinx and AAPI communities. They're actually targeting all communities of color. I know we're not talking about, I know that this conversation is specifically focused on Latinx and API communities, but there have also been many attempts to target Black communities, African-American communities as well. So I want to turn our conversation a little bit away from elections and think about the time in between elections. I remember right after the 2016 election, and Cambridge Analytica came out, and there was all this conversation about what role Cambridge Analytica played in the outcome of that election. And all of a sudden, this conversation about social media fueled disinformation started to happen. And then as we got closer to 2020, it started to come up again. But in those in-between years, I was very concerned about how disinformation was starting to organize communities of color, how it was starting to, to take narratives and exploit them. Because once we get to the election, so much has already been decided. And so, I'm really interested in what happens in the in-between time between elections, especially as we start to think about what happened with regards to COVID-19, and we think about what's going to happen now and into the future. So Jonathan, we're seeing disinformation narratives really taking advantage of local language news, news sources, and diasporic platforms such as WeChat. And you've also talked before about how Southeast Asian shadow economies of disinformation are aiming for long-term manipulation of public opinion. How would you describe the disinformation economy and the impact of communities in the United States?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mariana, for that. I guess for me, in my work on Southeast Asian shadow economies of disinfo, I've made it a point to really emphasize how it's often from a place of ordinary people having a sense of distrust with mainstream media, in which alternative news sites, straight talking influencers and political pundits become more attractive to ordinary people. So thinking about Southeast Asian countries of Philippines and Indonesia being the most active on social media, it's because they feel that influencers here, news sites here, finally represent them and talk their language, right? I'm thinking about how elite-owned media in those countries will often only represent perspectives of the wealthy. So, and we can think about, how to apply that lens to local communities and diasporic communities here. So, you mentioned, Mariana, earlier how AAPI Latinx are not monoliths, right? And there's many different ethnic differences, linguistic differences, and ideological positions among them. But one thing that is kind of common is this feeling of they're not being represented well and enough, or misrepresented, underrepresented, made invisible, used as caricatures by mainstream media or so-called liberal media, right? So thinking about how news events of tragedies affecting AAPI communities would often mispronounce names of victims, will prioritize the voice of the perpetrator, the white perpetrator, over voices of victims' families, for example. And even entertainment media would be guilty of perpetuating so many stereotypes of Asian women as sexual objects, Asian men as like math geeks, etc. And so there's this feeling that, hey, maybe we should be turning to alternative media that could actually represent our issues. And this is where the kind of narratives that right-wing targeted media toward communities flourish. I would be hesitant to kind of like blame diasporic media as like the main source of this info. There are conspiracy theories that circulate among them, but they're mostly kind of entrepreneurial spaces for buy and sell, mutual aid. I would agree with Mintu that it's most often the right-wing media of Breitbart, Fox News, Epoch Times that are often actually just reshared within these community spaces. But as I mentioned earlier, there are this more targeted news sites also toward younger audiences that aim for radicalization. And so that's where they kind of like insinuate that mainstream media have conspiratorial links with the Democrats. And therefore, you should trust us. We are going to report Asian hate crimes for you and help you protect your communities in a very slanted, misleading way.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm curious, Sonia or Mintu, if you want to add here, because Sonia.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when you were talking about what is happening in off-election years, I can't help but think about what happened in 2019 in El Paso and how a manifesto was posted on 8chan. And ultimately, we lost the lives of at least 20 people. And it was a targeted attack against Latinos. And so in this way, there is the capacity of our digital sphere to create the mechanisms necessary to embolden this type of violence. On the other side, there's a lot to be said about Section 230 and free speech, but ultimately there is a stifling and silencing of speech from particular voices. This is true of women of color. And so as I approach this conversation today, we actually have precedent in terms of what is possible. And if you look at cyber exploitation and the publication of intimate pictures or media of women and the role of tech companies and platforms in combating and doing takedowns, there is a role there. But ultimately what is happening is that people are leading with hate and they're being encouraged and given a platform to do so. And it's not, you talked about a moral issue. This isn't a moral issue. This is a constitutional issue. And this is an issue for which our governments have yet to take the necessary strides to provide access to civil liberties and civil rights for all. And that is the frame there. And so when I think about the types of discourse that is occurring, part of it is just because of basic stupidity and racism. The fact that these platforms aren't able to monitor hate speech and misinformation in non-English languages just is wild to me. But it shouldn't be, because we see major campaigns still going to Google Translate instead of thinking about hiring people who are language capable to have convincing, nuanced messages. And that's where the people who put the money in the effort to market and actually engage in full commerce for these communities are going to be better off. And those that simply want to fight back with stupidity, it's going to be a loss for all of us.
I just love what Sonia just said. And you're cracking me up, but also it's just incredibly sad where we've come on this. The language barrier issue we've come across quite a bit. So, YouTube has a policy that for a while after January 6th, that they would remove video content or even channels that were perpetuating the big lie around the election. And when we contacted them, BuzzFeed just did an article on this a couple of weeks ago. When we contacted them and sent them specific links of videos that were in Vietnamese that perpetuated the big lie and said, this violates your policy. Can you remove it? A, and then B, can we partner with you? You don't have to pay us. We will volunteer to flag for you video content that does this. Can we just have a contact and try to do this? And the answer was, thank you for letting us know. And we will, pass this along to management. And of course, we never heard back. But the idea that, and to Sonia's other point about, it is any content that is we're policing content that is for the vast majority of Americans, white Americans, where the communities of color, our communities are being targeted. And it's almost, we know that it's hard, but it's actually not that hard to really try to do this, right? I mean, we're volunteering. We actively tried to find the right people within YouTube to contact, and it was still, we couldn't get anywhere. And in fact, it wasn't until that BuzzFeed article was published where BuzzFeed asked YouTube that a few videos were then taken down in Vietnamese. But, I pulled together a cadre of, I think, 25 translators, all doing this for free in all number of Asian languages. It's not hard to find people to just flag content or to look at stuff for you. So that's a real issue. And then just on the Facebook thing, I mean, Sonia's exactly right. I don't think this is a moral issue. This is a public policy issue. It's a constitutional issue. We cannot expect, and we shouldn't expect, for Facebook and other tech companies to be making these decisions for the public good, in the public interest. That's not their job. And we shouldn't ask them to do that. I mean, for sure, in the absence of policies and regulations, we're almost begging them and hoping. I mean, yesterday, I was kind of hoping that they would make the right decision. But that in our society, that's just not the way. We can't relinquish the public good and and common, the public square to companies and whatever incentives and decisions are driving their bottom line. So I really think this is the job of our democracy. It's a job of our political system, as broken or in need of repair that it is. But it really is a job of our democracy and the American people to decide on how we police and manage these platforms according to the Constitution.
Thank you. I feel like you are speaking to my heart here when we're talking about the need for, that this isn't a moral issue, right? We can't expect companies like Facebook to self-moderate. It is not in their self-interest. And we, as you're saying, we need, this is a constitutional issue. It's also an issue about the legal regime. We need the right legal regime in order to really handle and address, the internet. So
one other thing, can I just
go ahead, please?
One
yes,
other comment that, I would bet you, I mean, maybe as a policy, they, generally these companies would like less regulation than more, but I bet you it would actually create a whole lot less headaches for them if we just had some basic guidelines and that we just said by law, this is what companies have to do. And then it's not up to them, right?
Right.
That we shouldn't be asking them to take on the job of what take on, the responsibility of what public officials should be doing. And I would bet you that they would actually, in their heart of hearts, would prefer that, so they don't have to deal with these things. And then they can tell their shareholders, hey, it's not up to us. This was somebody else's decision.
Well, I really hope that the CEOs of these companies are listening in right now and taking that advice. So I want to move forward into some solutions, because we're here to talk about the problem, to talk about how Latinx and AAPI communities are being impacted by disinformation, but we also need to be talking about how we can address it. And as we've talked about already, we need a multi-pronged approach, right? We need long-term strategy to address the issue. We need to build the fluency and understanding of how propaganda works and develop sophisticated approaches to inoculate our people against mis and disinformation. We've talked about needing to make sure that that elections, that electoral campaigns are really thinking about us, investing in us, and that where there are gaps, where there are vacuums, that is a place where disinformation can grow and spread. So Mintu, I want to turn this to you. Talk to us about the challenges younger Vietnamese activists have been facing in organizing their parents and family members. What are some of the strategies that they've been employing? And, and a little bit, you just touched on this a little bit, but if you want to say more about what our responsibility is in holding tech companies accountable, and how can we get our communities much more involved in this fight for tech governance?
This is like the huge question of the decade, right? It's so big. But let me just say, at the end of the day, and you started this exactly right. This is an age-old problem. Propaganda, misinformation is an age-old human problem. And so at the heart of it, it actually has a human solution, which is how do we, on an interpersonal level, make sure that we are able to inoculate our families and ourselves from propaganda and misinformation. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence on this, and I think some studies as well, of just how you can flag certain approaches that people who are, or sources of fake news and misinformation, disinformation, the tactics that they're going to use, and you can sort of flag that, like within the Asian American community. So I can speak both to and know more about Vietnamese, just because there's also the family element to that. But we already know that we can warn our friends and family that people are going to call Biden a communist, that whatever Democratic or whatever candidate out there that isn't lockstep with Trump is probably going to be called a communist at some point. That people are going to use a grain of truth and blow it up into something big, for instance, and talk about vaccinations or COVID or the economy or whatever it might be. And we can start to just tell our community, that warn them that there are these tactics that are going to be used, and to watch out for them. Viet Fact Check, which is a group and a website that was started within Pivot, the group that I'm on the board for. And it actually lays out, like, here are 8 things to worry about, to look out for when you're looking at news, and how you might just, prevent yourself from being drawn into that and believing it. And so I think part of inoculation is just talking to your parents, talking to your elders, aunts and uncles. In the Asian American community, it's mostly elders who are succumbing to this. And really just trying to understand where they're coming from, because a lot of this is coming from a lot of hurt from homeland politics, right? I know, the Taiwanese community, the Vietnamese community, a lot of communities feel like there is and understand the sort of geopolitics of rising China and the competition and what that might mean for American, freedom, democracy, lifestyle. And some of that is actually very real. Now, we shouldn't racialize it, and we shouldn't also jump to conclusions that anybody who wants to take a pragmatic approach to this is therefore a communist. So I think, there's ways to sort of find those tactics and warn family members and others about it, and just warn our communities. So to the extent that we can get that out there, I think is really great. And, I was just texting with my brother earlier today, who said that he's been reading about how young Vietnamese and young Asian Americans within their own families are finding those YouTube channels and then going into the settings for their parents or their grandparents and disabling certain channels so that they wouldn't automatically be fed, the next video and the next video after they watch something. So there's a little bit of that. But I do think, just on the broader scale, we do need to find ways to get our policymakers or political leaders to take this seriously. They are. I think folks just don't know what the answer is. And I think we need to elect people who understand technology and understand, these trends and how fast, technology is changing, to be able to really come up with solutions. And I think we also have to work with these companies. As I said, I actually don't think that at the end of the day, they are just so staunchly anti-regulation that they don't want to have a conversation about it. In fact, the folks that I've spoken to do want to. They're just trying to find the right sort of way to do that. And I think we have to continue to press our policymakers and have conversations like this one. We can come up with solutions together. I'll leave that at that. I'd love to hear actually what my colleagues have to say.
Sonia or Jonathan, do either of you want to weigh in?
Yes. So, I just want to share that there's something happening on the chat within this discussion right now that often happens for public meetings, and it rises to the challenge that lawyers are put in a situation where, when people use derogatory, discriminatory, and outright racist language, that it's permissible under the First Amendment. And so I think we're going to get to the story of that, but that's certainly occurring for some of us on the chat that we're privy to, not everybody. But to the point in terms of, the trusted message, look, here's the thing. this is not an individual issue, in my opinion. It is a structural issue that is backed by moneyed interests. And so what is so devastating about that is that reason and facts become less palatable even from trusted messengers. And it requires even more time and resources and relationship building to cut through some of the minutia. And I'll give you an example. As it relates to COVID vaccines, I was just able and privy to have lunch with a dear friend. We're both vaccinated, both from Los Angeles, both identify as Chicana, and she has family members, including, you know, a mother who does not want to get vaccinated. And so she, like me, highly educated, right? Elite law pedigrees, and going through a reasonable analysis of, well, if, you know, you have a 1 out of 1,000 chance of getting COVID in Los Angeles, would you agree? Yes. You know, if you're exposed to someone, 50% chance, and you go down that range, and then you think about the math equation with a vaccine. Well, 90% effective, right? And so this was the reason that the mother proffered as to why she didn't want to get a vaccine. It was only 90% effective. So going down the math, no vaccine, high likelihood that you could be exposed to COVID-19. We know in Los Angeles, that is a death sentence if you identify as Latinx. And that is because of our failed systems. If you have the vaccine, you know, 1 in 1,000 chance that you're going to get exposed. But even through all of that, then the mom was like, well, where'd you come up with this? She's like, my own brain. So this is her daughter that she is so proud of. And the problem being is that you have this messaging that is occurring. Is it occurring organically? Hell no. Is it being shared organically? Yes. And it is creating fissures. And it's problematic because ultimately there is one outcome here, which is the people with the least access to resources to not only survive our crises, but to thrive during recovery are the ones who are being scapegoated.
Thank you, Sonia. I want to, Jonathan, I want to move to questions because there's a bunch of folks have dropped a bunch of questions in the chat. So we'll take a couple questions and I'm going to kick it over to Nick actually to moderate this section.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and thank you very much for asking a question about solutions. I saw that Amy, Sam, Ellen, and Cheryl all had asked questions about solutions, so I'm glad that we touched upon this. But my name is Nick. Like Cass, I'm a student of public policy at the Kennedy School, and I am the co-chair of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Caucus. And our first question comes from Mark. He has a question on the intersection with religion, especially with large portions of the AAPI and Latinx communities identifying as Christian. He asks, to what extent are extremist groups targeting Christian groups and churches with large Latinx and AAPI communities? And what are the effective messages that resonate strongly with Latinx and AAPI Christian communities that radicalizes them? And maybe I can kick this to Jonathan and Sonia.
Sure. Just to say that anti-abortion memes, posts, and narratives are real important like messaging strategies in terms of appealing to like the conservative sentiments of Filipino American communities. So this is something that that we saw in the last election, and about like various kinds of frames associated with like saving the children and protecting the children. So once the Save the Children card gets played, and of course we can kind of like see its associations with various kinds of organized conspiracy theory movements. You do know that there's something at play here. Other people have spoken about around child trafficking, sex trafficking, and again those kinds of frames, and how that might be appealing to broad sections of people who are parts of church groups, who are actively participating in particular online communities and Facebook groups. And so those are potential ways in which they might be colliding with these kinds of frames and narratives.
You know, this is Sonia. I think this is something about just meeting people where they are and recognizing the issues that will move them. lots of the actions that are predicated on hate are based on fear, including those that seek to uphold white supremacy, which we need look no further than white people for that, including the widespread income distribution and who wins and who loses. So as it relates to non-white people, I think it's really important, and I really appreciate Dr. Ong saying this, of like not blaming people of color, or marginalized individuals, or marginalized ethnic outlets, but understanding who's at stake. And in this particular case, who's at stake is those that are getting the attention and the spotlight and the news and the free media. And those are the platforms. Now, who also is winning are the people who enjoy this type of chaos and the dissolution and the threats to our democracy. One that is on very, very fragile ground right now. And so when we think about how do we overcome this and how do we embolden people to be on a pathway towards civil rights and full dignity, it's really hard when your courts are co-opted. It's really hard when your elections are co-opted. And it's really hard when you have leaders that don't have the skills. But I think akin to what we're seeing right now is that there is a movement and there is the capacity to overcome this if they are emboldened. And that's where the spotlight should be. I think that if people actually have a fair opportunity to get information, and that includes the role of government to give accurate, factual, translated, culturally competent information, we'll be in a better place. But to continue to ignore this is really a recipe for disaster, for which we have very nimble ground to overcome.
Thank you, Sonia. And I want to pull this thread on platforms, actually, because there was also a couple of questions about this. Caroline from the Anti-Defamation League had a question about platforms. Sonia, you mentioned 8chan. Jonathan, you touched base on Fox News. Mintu, you mentioned the Epoch Times and Breitbart. And Mariana, you mentioned YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. But as many of these platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are starting to actually police, or starting to at least, police their sites, what are the platforms on the rise that are being used more frequently to target AAPI and Latinx communities with disinformation? And maybe we can go in reverse order: Mintu, Sonia, and then Jonathan.
And I think it's a lot of the ones that you mentioned. Each ethnic group has its version of WeChat or WhatsApp or Viber for the Vietnamese or whatever it may be. So I think that that's also why it feels like it's so much harder to deal with this, and that we really do need a more systematic approach to how we address this issue. We need to also start going on the offensive and start putting alternative views and factual views and information, on these platforms and get that information out there. Just one thing on the previous question, because we've also seen this, and it is that this issue of the kinds of things that appeal to Christian groups and people's faith, the transgender bans and those issues right now is really lighting up, I think, a lot of Asian American communities, but also just Christians across, the country who think that there is a real threat that, transgender bathrooms or, these, sports and is going to hurt America and hurt traditional American society. And so, I think that we're seeing on all sorts of channels as well.
Sonia, and then Jonathan.
I'm over here at a doozy right now with this chat room and what is happening. And so I'm going to return to that in a moment. But in terms of the role to play, look, and this is really important for students in the room in terms of what is high resource, long-term, unclear of outcome, and what is low-hanging fruit. And so we often use the carrot and the stick. And so it's hard to incentivize people with carrots that have billions of money and have made even more billions, while we've seen millions of people file for unemployment. And so then we get to the threat of the stick. Now, each one of these incidents is its own factual scenario, requiring a lot of resources for litigation, but could be really annoying for some companies. Similarly, a stick is regulatory schemes that maybe companies do not agree with. So let me present the middle ground, which is low hanging, in the role of a new presidential administration, and to have, the Attorney General actually convene these companies and talk about what is happening from a victim's perspective, what is happening from an academic perspective, what is happening from a practitioner perspective, and lift up the platforms that are doing something, right? Twitter banning Donald Trump? Yes, that is precedent. Now, is it controlling? No. But what can you do to create that ecosystem and that mutual convergence so that other platforms can fall in line, or at least do low-hanging fruit where it's easier to do takedowns? That can happen at the state level. Kamala Harris, when she was Attorney General, did this on the issue of cyber exploitation. We brought Danielle Citron, who is a law professor and focuses on privacy and freedom of expression, over to talk about it, but we also had victims at the table. And we had a working group. And so was there a carrot and stick in a gummy bear? Maybe, but let's do that in places where these technology companies are situated, especially if those AGs are affiliated with a particular party that is interested in this type of reform. I would think about places like Nevada. I would think about, places like Delaware, California, New York. There's no reason that an elected official cannot include this in their affirmative agenda.
Great point on low-hanging fruits there, Sonia. So for me, I thought it was long a low-hanging fruit to go after racial slurs online. And yeah, for me, like hashtag China virus and its variations of Chinese virus, hashtag Chinazi, they are still on the platform. And I don't think Twitter, Facebook are doing enough to monitor and police these. My colleagues at the Shorenstein Center, Gabby Lim, Alexi Abrams, Lotus Rowan, and I have been coding some of these tweets, and they're really traumatizing to go over. I thought those were low-hanging fruits. They're still there. The question is, what are new platforms? So I think there's a rise of like young conservative Asian influencers on Instagram and TikTok that use their inflammatory language, reference pop culture that appeal to younger generations. And that's what concerns me. Some of these accounts even kind of poke fun at BTS, for example, in a kind of poking fun at their masculinity, saying that they're effeminate. You should be looking at your elders, the rooftop Koreans who defended themselves and who are real men and masculine. And so those are real concerning, that these are newer accounts and influencers that are trying to cultivate like a next generation conservative Asian communities.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, Sonia, and Mintu. Want to be cognizant of time right now and pass it back to Mariana. There's a ton more questions, but back to you.
I wanted to thank you, Nicholas, and just thank everybody for joining us today. We have 1 minute left, and so we're going to close it out. And I just want to underscore that we are, this conversation is an important one for us to be having right now. It is one that, and this is just the beginning, and we need to keep talking about the effective ways to combat dis and misinformation in AAPI and Latinx communities. As Sonia was mentioning earlier, this isn't just about our elections. Our very lives are on the line. Our very lives are on the line. And so we need to continue this conversation and continue to take this really seriously. Thank you to each of the panelists. Deeply appreciate your scholarship and what you've brought to this conversation today.
Thanks so much for this.